Yeah, the theme is unemployment, and there's a little bit of a division of labour, as one might say. Cybèle is going to take a little bit more of the sharp end, I think, of the 1920s and 30s, and my task, as I saw it, was to provide a little bit of context around the notion of what it meant to be unemployed and to be protesting in the 1930s. And I'm just going to try and do that through four kind of short headings. I was struck by the fact that there's a lot of P's. There's politics, there's protest, there are political parties, there's parliament, there's the police, and then there's what I call the palace, which is the notion of the politics of the court, of who's sleeping with whom and doing what, which so much populates our political commentary today, and perhaps didn't so much in the 1930s, perhaps to their credit. So I guess it's very appropriate to start with this image, firstly because it's literally outside the door, and secondly, as you probably know, it's probably the single biggest unemployed demonstration in Wellington during the course of the Depression on the 10th of May 1932. And so my first little topic was to talk about protest and Parliament and the political process, because this, of course, is happening outside Parliament. That's why it's taking place. But what's perhaps, I think, also worth remembering is this was the last day of this particular parliamentary session that was one of the two main austerity parliaments, the other one being the one in 1931. And so not only there's an element, in a sense, of desperation about being there before the politicians are about to disperse and trying to get results from the protest and the demonstration. The demonstrators were not allowed into the grounds of Parliament. They waited for hours out there for someone to come out and talk to them. It got dark, it started to rain, it was a typical Wellington day. And in those days before daylight saving, it got dark much sooner, if you like. But eventually someone did come out and talk, but by then much of the crowd had dispersed, and as you probably know, there was then the disturbances along Lambton Quay and Manor Street and the breaking of windows and so on and so forth. But the point I wanted to dwell on was this connection between protest and the political process, the way that the two interact, what one is trying to achieve out of the other one, and how the other one may stand back. And the other theme I wanted to mention that's relevant to this one is that this was an unemployed march. Many of the demonstrations through that session of Parliament, which opened in March, were about the wage cuts and about the abolition of compulsory arbitration. And these two protest movements kind of sit alongside each other rather than amalgamate. And in many ways, the Labour Party at the time was far more active in the former, in the protest against the dilution of the arbitration provisions and against the wage cuts, whereas it was the United Unemployed Workers Movement that was most active in mobilising the unemployed. And that's an interesting part, again, of how politics can work and how you get different channels of protest operating in slightly different ways alongside each other as much as identical. As you also probably know, partly because of these disturbances in Wellington, but also even more markedly the ones in Auckland a few weeks before, most of the major cities banned outdoor demonstrations and marches from this time for at least a couple of years. So this kind of picture was not going to be seen for some time after this particular day in May 1932. So that was the first point I want to make. I just mentioned in passing that if you want to get a flavour of the Parliament at the time, of what these men, and of course they were all men, were doing up in those smoke-filled rooms up in Parliament, Robin Hyde's Journalese is an absolutely terrific account. It's immensely readable as anything else she wrote, and not very often talked about these days, so I recommend it. Second point I wanted to make was about policing the protest, and I've got Richard Hill here, so I know that I'll get corrected if I get anything slightly wrong. But the point that I wanted to make about policing during the protest, and obviously policing was a very large part of the sharp end of what happened between the unemployed and the forces of law and order. And it's relevant because we just had the comment about Jared's book, is that it's not in a way a peculiarly Depression phenomenon. It very much comes out of the kind of policing that took place back in the Great Waterfront Dispute of 1913 and through the First World War. And it's interesting that of some of the actions that were taken against the unemployed and against political protesters in the Depression. The famous Finance Act provision, Section 59, which had just been passed, which prevented public servants from taking political action, was really partly directed at the Post and Telegraph Association, and that had a big stoush with the government in the 1920s. So there was almost an element of revenge about that act. The sedition prosecutions of Griffin, Robinson and Galbraith were brought under the War Regulations Continuance Act 1920. Isn't that a great title? The War Regulations Continuance Act. Most of you, I think, know that 1920 the war was actually had been over for 2 years, but that wasn't the problem. And the Public Safety Conservation Act, although it was a new measure, was in fact essentially not unlike other pieces of legislation. That is one piece of legislation on the left, and this is another one on the right. And you can see, if you don't look at the greyed out words, that the text is almost identical. The first one is the Public Safety, I've got them back to front, Public Safety Preservation Act Victoria from 1928, and the second one is our own Public Safety Conservation Act. And these acts were passed in Queensland and Victoria and South Australia, and in fact the granddaddy of them was the one passed in the United Kingdom in 1920. What's interesting about the New Zealand one is that in a section 4, which I have not reproduced there, there's a special clause which allows the police to take powers in the course of such emergency, and that does not appear in the other pieces of legislation, and there are reasons for that which I'm not going to go into here, but one of the ironies is that the original Victoria Act was passed in 1923, and Richard will know, but maybe not everyone else will, is that the reason that was passed was because there was a police strike. And so the police went in Melbourne, we know, is a city which has a lot of challenges, and the police went on strike there in 1923, and that was what produced that act. So needless to say, it did not have a clause providing for the police to take power, but in the New Zealand case it did, and that reflected the police's disillusionment with the response of particularly the Auckland authorities and their influence on the government at the time. So that's a comment I just wanted to make about the policing, as well as the nature of the intersection between protests and politics. Third point I wanted to make is I mentioned that after May 1932, permits were very rarely given for demonstrations or marches on the scale that it had happened before then. And that lasted through to the winter of 1934. Now, that did not mean that there were not things going on. I'll come on to that in a minute. But it's interesting that when Parliament resumed in July 1934, that was when a whole lot of protest recurred. And it reflects, again, that intersection between protest and the political process. A lot of that was about free speech, and it was also about the whole business of extending the life of Parliament. The 1932 session had extended the parliamentary term by 1 year. So the election was going to happen not in 1934, but in 1935. And that was an unpopular measure to many, obviously, in the opposition. The 1934 Parliament made that permanent. We were always going to have 4-year parliaments. And so that generated a huge amount of protest at the time that we should stick with the 3-year parliaments, even though the term itself had already been extended to 4 years. And the free speech thing was kind of analogous to that. So there again is that intersection. And what's also revealing is when that Parliament reassembled in mid-1934 was the first time, barring 3 months at the end of 1933, that Parliament had met since March 1933. It's a very unprecedented way to think about the way Parliament functions today, but I think it also affected the protest culture of the time. The fourth point I wanted to make of the 5 was that, as I said, the mass gatherings of the unemployed were not allowed, were not permitted, or indeed of any kind through those couple of years. They kind of did resume in 1934, but of course there was an awful lot of activity involving the unemployed of a whole variety of kinds through that time. But what's also kind of interesting, and I think to me this is a little interesting because it bears a little bit on the COVID situation today, is that through that post-1932 time, there was a lot more sympathy elicited from what we might call loosely the business classes. And that may seem very puzzling in terms of the kind of conventional understanding that the Depression was an era where a very hostile business class imposed austerity on the working class. And there's an element of truth in that, of course. But it's not the entire story, and we don't have to go to any kind of idealist or altruistic zone to understand why. So this is one of the best examples of this, a civic protest to Coates, who at that time was the acting Prime Minister, in June 1933. Now, the trough of the Depression in New Zealand was the winter of 1933. So since those demonstrations in 1933, there'd been one very bad winter, one of the coldest winters since the beginning of the century, and then now going into a second winter. And this is what these people said. And this was a delegation of business leaders, that they were gravely concerned at the spirit of hopelessness and unrest manifesting. And this is I won't try to go into why the notion that Coates was this great liberal leader who broke with economic orthodoxy is essentially a myth. But this is one of the ways that you can start to get a sense of why the city communities were so upset, because year on, there had been no recovery. The reason, of course, is obvious from this part of it, and that's why I don't want to suggest that they were kind of altruistic. But it's in a way very like the COVID situation today, where the business community can be very vocal about the need for expansion and government support. The classic thing whereby you privatise your profit and you socialise your loss. It was operating at that time as well. That pretty much brings me to the end of the points that I want to say, and I hope I'm sticking within my time. I just wanted to finally conclude on a cultural point, which is about the fact that this was, in a way, very unlike the present era, although the eruption of activity around the Black Lives Matter was an interesting contrast, an era of mass gatherings. People would turn out in their thousands for all kinds of public events in a way that is unfamiliar to us now. One of the biggest was a gathering of 7,000 people in Auckland in November 1933. What were they protesting about? They were protesting about the government's determination to close down Station 1ZB. And as a result of that huge outcry, the business community and the public got together, and 1ZB was restarted with the famous Friendly Road program. But there were many other cases, and I just wanted to finish with these. This was, the same cenotaph we saw at the beginning of the thing on the 17th of April, the day it was dedicated. Another big crowd, very different crowd, obviously, something I've talked to Jared about. That's the dedication of the Carillon. That was a week later on Anzac Day 1932, another huge crowd, and that was a rugby game and athletic park. So on that slightly irrelevant and irreverent note, I will hand over to Cybèle. Thank you very much.
My turn to talk about the 1930s depression tonight. My turn, I want to offer you two snapshots of politics during the 1930s depression era. One from Te Ao Māori and the other from Te Ao Pākehā. And they centre on two people, Tahu Pōtiki Wiremu Ratana and Alexander Drennan, and their movement building experiences during this time. Tahu Pōtiki Wiremu Ratana of Ngāti Raukawa and Taranaki descent emerged as a prophet amidst the influenza pandemic in 1918. In 1873, about the 25th of January, he was born into a wheat growing and farming whānau just out of Bulls. He was raised with teachings of the Methodist Church and also the teachings of his aunt, Mary Rikiriki, who was a Wanganui prophet, a faith healer, a dispenser of herbal medicine, who herself had learned at Parihaka from Tohu into Whiti, and had gone off and started her own Church of the Holy Spirit. So he was raised with the teachings of both. Ratana would go on to marry Te Urumana Ao, Ngāpaki, of Ngāroru and Ngāti Hine descent, and together they had 4 sons and 3 daughters. Now the influenza pandemic was spread by wartime transport in Aotearoa, and very, very quickly, over a couple of months in late 1918, about 9,000 people died. There was a very high Māori death toll, perhaps as high as 2,500 of that number. There was very little assistance for Māori, and sometimes outright racism from public authorities when assistance was sought. So in this terrible time, new Māori leaders emerged to care for their people. And so it was that on the 8th of November, Ratana received a divine revelation from the Holy Spirit and emerged from this encounter with healing abilities based on prayer. Those who followed his spiritual advice and ideas survived influenza, while others around them did not. And over the next 2 years, people flocked to visit him, they were healed, and they stayed on to be near their spiritual leader. Ratana Pā very quickly expanded, growing into a place of about 100 houses. They had their own baker, butcher, blacksmith, motor engineers, builders. And this community became a base for a religious movement founded on 2 texts, the Bible and the Treaty of Waitangi. Tahahi Ratana, the Ratana Church, was established in 1925 and by 1928 had 20,000 followers. At this point, Ratana turned his attention to politics, selecting 4 people to represent Ngā Haue Whā, the 4 Māori parliamentary seats. And by 1943, this prophecy would be fulfilled. Ratana preached the gospel of Māori unity, ko tāhitanga, and also mana Māori motuhake, the separate prestige and nationhood of Māori. And in this he saw preserving te reo Māori as key. A petition called the United Assembly for the Rights and Privileges of the Māori people under the Treaty of Waitangi was prepared. It listed all of the injustices due to the dishonoured treaty and requested a review of Māori land confiscation and the laws that enabled such confiscation, as well as the laws that had undermined traditional Māori rights and customs. It was taken around the country, it was discussed everywhere, and gained, by 1932, 38,000 signatures. The movement appealed to those most affected by landlessness, economic deprivation, and of course this was all exacerbated by the growing depression that Malcolm just talked about. In fact, it's estimated that by 1933, 40% of the Māori population were unemployed. Eruera Te Rakatini was the first Ratana MP for Southern Māori to be elected in 1932. He was a staunch advocate for Māori unemployed, challenged racial prejudice in the way that relief payments occurred for Māori. So this is my favourite quote from him. I have a statement from a Māori with a wife and 2 children who's receiving 15 shillings a week, while a European with the same responsibilities get £1 7 shillings 6 per week. The difference is made, we are told, because of the difference in the mode of living. A Māori can live on eels. We will be expected someday to live off the smell of an oiled rag. If this sort of thing is to go on, I do not know what will happen to so unfortunate natives who are struggling to keep their wives and families on such miserable allocations. Te Rakatini also tabled a petition calling for statutory recognition of the Treaty of Waitangi. It would be 13 years before this petition was discussed. In the meantime, Ratana's son, Tokoauru Ratana, and Te Rakatini were elected in 1935, and they sought an alliance with the first Labour government, led by Michael Joseph Savage, as I'm sure you all know. They became Labour Party members and started to generate Māori members, building to about 9,000 in about 160 committees. So they were extraordinary organisers. Ratana met with Savage, presented some gifts to represent this informal alliance with the Labour Party. They also organised a Māori hui to discuss the concerns of Māori in 1936. Ratana delegates there focused on Māori rights granted by the Treaty of Waitangi and argued that Māori would gain real equality with Pāhia once Māori had real powers in terms of administering their own affairs. The 1936 conference went on to stipulate that all acts, they argued, in the New Zealand statutes books, which had rendered Māori destitute, should be repealed and brought within the spirit, intent and meaning of the Treaty of Waitangi. For Māori at this conference, it was about accessing a real economic base, about getting Māori land back. And that once these laws had been repealed, Māori should set up their own department that would oversee Māori welfare in all its aspects. Now, in 1938, the first Labour government did begin to address such inequalities for Māori under the law. So the Social Security Act entitled Māori and Pākehā to the same welfare benefits, which had not been the case. Right? Māori men were paid 30 to 50% less before this time. However, the key Ratana demands that Māori have a share of governing power, mana Māori motohaki, were not addressed. Ratana died at Ratana Pā in 1939, and Ratana MPs continued to be elected and to work as well as they could through the Labour Party. In 1975, Ratana MP Matu Rata achieved part of the Ratana mission with an act that established the Waitangi Tribunal, finally a forum to begin to have these conversations about contravention of the Treaty of Waitangi. But when issues were sidelined again, he was put on the backbench, he gave up, and in 1979 left to form the Mana Motohaki movement. So as we know, Māori have continued to advocate for real power over Māori affairs, whether it be called Māori sovereignty, tino rangatiratanga, and most recently a constitutional transformation movement led by Moana Jackson and Margaret Motu that led to the Mātaki Mai report. The Mātaki Mai report spelled out possibilities for how tangata whenua and tangata tiriti, those given the right to be here by the treaty like myself, could share power in dual spheres of influence, and gives a number of possibilities and models for how this could occur. So I wonder, rather than waiting for our political leaders to come to the table and talk, whether tangata tiriti can think about ways to come together and talk about how we can get behind such decolonisation efforts, how that would occur, what would we say. So that's my first snapshot. As far as I know from my research, in the 1930s, working class Pākehā were not debating the treaty. But, as Malcolm has said, unemployment certainly loomed large in their lives. In Auckland, a key figure amongst the organised unemployed was a man named Alexander Drennan. Alex Drennan was born in Scotland in 1899. He worked in the Clyde shipyards, was active in his union. He married a thread mill worker called Elizabeth Hamilton in 1924, and together they immigrated to Auckland in about 1925. In Auckland, Drennan was a labourer, continued his union activism, joined the Labour Party. Elizabeth and Alex's first son was born in 1926, but tragically died not long afterwards. Their second son was born a year later and lived on. Unemployed and radicalised by the Depression, Drennan became heavily involved in the unemployed workers movement and left the Labour Party and joined the Communist Party in 1931. Now, most communists were unemployed during this time, and so that is why they played a prominent role in organising unemployed groups that formed locally in those big crowds outside labour bureaus where you had to line up for relief, on the relief sites themselves where you had to work in order to get relief payments. And they organised very radical actions, marches, strikes even, to try and put pressure on the government to do something about the enormous hardship they faced. They also formed the Anti-Eviction League to stop landlords from evicting tenants. So I want to tell you a story about that. In April 1931, unemployment relief payments were reduced significantly, and many could no longer simply afford to pay the rent. So for example, unemployed seafarer Johnny Mitchell, his wife Lorna and their baby girl defaulted on their rent. Their landlord declared them to have told them to leave and changed the locks on their house. So Drennan turned up with some of his communist comrades, most famously Jim Edwards and Alice Cassie, who you can see in this image. And with the Anti-Eviction League, they took the new locks off, they brought the Mitchells back into their house, and they picketed the place. And these kind of practices became commonplace for the Anti-Eviction League in inner city working class suburbs such as these. So inspired by this action that had been taken for his own family, Johnny Mitchell then joined the next eviction. So a 3-day anti-eviction picket happened at the Norfolk Street house in Ponsonby that has been captured in this image, where the police arrested all the communists present, and Drennan spent a month in jail with hard labour. Now Drennan got to know Johnny Mitchell. They were going to become best of friends, despite the fact that Mitchell was in the Labour Party. Because Drennan had a practice of practicing united front, organising, working across the political spectrum at the local level to try and bring, to shift the hardship for people. But this was not actually Communist Party policy at the time. In 1931, unemployed workers gathered to try and forge a national unemployed workers movement, but sectarianism totally undermined these efforts. The Communist Party had an ultra-left policy, and communists regularly accused the Labour Party and trade unionists of being class traitors. Reactionary officials who sold the unemployed in time of need were regular occurrences in the Red Worker, their paper. They accused the labour movement of supporting the 1930 unemployment legislation that was seen as so inadequate, of organising delegations that went nowhere rather than staunch demonstrations. For their part, of course, trade unions were losing their members to unemployment in droves, right? They were having wage cuts, they were cash-strapped, and they were suspicious of unemployed organisations organising outside the labour movement. They recommended unemployed remain attached to their union and that they rely on their trade union officials to represent them. Wellington Central Labour MP Peter Fraser described unemployed workers' movement efforts to organise demonstration as against workers' interests and designed to help Moscow and communism. So red baiting was also alive and well. Efforts were further undermined by a series of riots and disturbances that occurred in Auckland, Dunedin, Christchurch, Wellington and Huntly in 1932 that Malcolm talked about too. In Auckland, thousands of people, as you can see there, attended a peaceful demonstration at the town hall to call on the government to make life livable. When Jim Edwards, as you can see there, stood up to address the crowd, he was hit with a baton by a police officer and all hell broke loose. People were suffering from prolonged hardship, the passive violence of poverty, and here was the authorities' response: further violence. The crowd erupted into anger, broke windows, and looted all the way down Queen Street. In response, this is when the government put emergency regulations in place, which gave police unlimited power, and the Auckland City Council banned soapbox politics from the streets. No more getting on your soapbox and preaching. Now, Communist Party and unemployed workers' movements were completely surprised by the riots, but they were blamed for instigating them and jailed afterwards. And it was in this context that the trade unions decided to form their own organisation for the unemployed, the National Unemployed Union. But other things were going on. Women who'd come into the unemployed workers movement stepped up to play leadership roles while the male leadership were in jail. And some of them went on to form the Working Women's Movement in 1934, and this is their 10-point programme. Amidst these points, you'll see no discrimination against married or single women in employment or relief, support whatever the National Unemployed Workers Movement demands are, please, and no discrimination between Māori and Pākehā. And so you'll see evidence there that there was certainly some awareness about discrimination going on that Māori faced. Prior to the 1935 election, the National Unemployed Workers Movement submitted a list of demands to the Labour Party, wanting increased relief, sustenance payments, relief payments for women and youths for the first time, and again, no discrimination between Māori and Pākehā. Savage agreed that he would honour these if they were elected. And so there was great jubilation, right, when the first Labour government was elected, even amongst some of the grassroots of the Communist Party, right? However, continuing rivalry between the two unemployed organisations meant neither were recognised in the end by the incoming government. What happened was the General Labourers Union argued that subsidised workers, those on relief, should be represented by their union, not by this unemployed workers movement. And they got their way. The 1936 Act stipulated that all those in relief work would automatically belong to the union that it was attached to, that kind of work was attached to. And in 1938, the Social Security Act made an unemployment benefit available to all people except for married women. So without coverage and with many of their objectives met, the unemployed organisations slowly dissipated through this time. What happened to Drennan? He joined the Communist Party National Committee, which now pursued a united front policy. He became a well-respected leader of the militant Auckland Waterside Workers Union. However, the Cold War that emerged after the war saw militant trade unionists targeted as a communist menace. Wharfies were locked out of work for 5 months in 1951 before they conceded defeat. Drennan, highly active in this movement, lost his job. No Auckland wharfies ever got their jobs back. He lost his union, and then the Communist Party blamed him for the defeat, and so he lost his position in the Communist Party as one of the leaders. The 1950s were a miserable time for him. His best friend died, his marriage broke up. It's only with the help of his friends that he finally got himself together by the late 50s, returned to union activism, and was part of the Socialist Unity Party that broke away from the Communist Party in 1966 and became their first president. When he died in 1971, you'll be pleased to know that the Auckland wharfies all stopped work and went to attend his funeral. And Drennan was given the highest tribute, as being one of the most respected, honest working class leaders, a real son of the working class. So, my friends, what do we make of red baiting and mudslinging? Divergence over radical or moderate tactics? Who should represent the unemployed that was going on amongst the Pākehā left in the 1930s? Why was solidarity between unemployed groups and trade unions so elusive? And do these challenges still face us in the current moment of COVID crisis and unemployment? I'll be interested in your thoughts. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou, ko se mocha tuko ingoa. I come from Narrabeen in northern Sydney, which is on Guy Moriago land. Come from both a mix of free settlers and convicts. Free settlers from England and Scotland and Germany. I find it very nerve-wracking to talk in front of public. I spend most of my days in front of a desk drawing by myself. But yeah, I'm talking today about We Are Beneficiaries, which started during our last election in 2017 when Materia Ture, the co-leader of the New Zealand Green Party, spoke at the party's AGM about her experience on social welfare in the 1990s. And she used her experiences to talk about how the social welfare system was a broken safety net that needed to be mended. For me, I was a pretty disillusioned voter. Politicians were talking about being proud Kiwis, about property ownership, about rockstar economies, and it didn't make a lot of sense or touch me until this. This was an issue that I felt connected to, and was one of the first times in the election campaign that I felt someone was speaking about people like me and my friends, talking about the traps of poverty and how messed up the welfare system is. Within the month, under a storm of controversy over her remarks, she had resigned as co-leader. I've been an artist for a long time and involved in using art to create social change and tell stories that don't often get told. Mostly from an educational viewpoint. I share stories about queer and trans people and our differences, and I think that stories change people. It's harder to ignore or hurt someone if you're touched by their humanity. I was moved so much by this issue that I knew I had to do something, and I thought quite deeply about it before I started. I knew it couldn't be just one voice, because even when you're a leader of a political party, you still risk your livelihood speaking out. It had to be a lot of us. And I figured that a few dozen of my artist friends and I could draw our self-portraits and share our stories. And if we shared them within our small networks, we know we weren't alone, and maybe we'd feel a bit better about it. But that isn't what happened. I popped my story up online, and then other people popped their stories up. And then people started messaging us, sharing their stories and saying, I'm not an artist, but this is my story. And more and more and more stories flooded in. Then artists started messaging to volunteer their time and energy, as artists often do, which is why we're often beneficiaries, to take those valuable stories and create art around them. Some were big stories of outrageous policies and treatments of beneficiaries, and some of those tiny microaggressions that occur every day that slowly grind people down. We collated the first 200 stories and presented them as a themed report to the government by the end of December that year. We sent them to several ministers and Jacinda Ardern. Having the project kind of take off and explode as fast as it did kind of left the group of us thinking about some of the ethical questions around telling the stories of marginalised people. One of the issues that kept coming up was exploitation. I'm queer and I'm trans, and I also use mental health services. So I'm really used to organisations and media asking me to share my story. We often ask marginalised people to put ourselves on display in order to make the case, to undo the stigma we have to face, or ask society to be less bigoted. This attempt to humanise minorities actually often ends up exploiting us and asks us to put our vulnerabilities on display in the name of the greater good, without providing any external holding of us, and can be really damaging. It's really important that the project was about lifting up voices and centering the needs of the people sharing the stories, so that it was an empowering process for people to take part of it. So the act of creating artworks was a way of showing that we were taking time to really value the stories and to create a beautiful way of holding and sharing their experiences. One of the other issues that we thought about as well was talking over. I haven't been on a benefit myself for a number of years. I'm not a mum or a parent. I'm specifically not a single mum, and I am Pākehā, and I've only ever had to access welfare in short stints. I carry with me quite a lot of privilege, and I think it's really important to me that we didn't have yet another white man talking over the experiences of people who are marginalised. And talking over is a really easy trap to fall into. I'm doing it right now. There's a tendency to take people's vulnerable stories and speak over them. We were really clear that we didn't want to speak over people. We wanted to use art to magnify the voices of people who wanted to be heard. So it was important that we let people use the words that they wanted to use and make sure that their voices were front and centre. We're really grateful to the people who shared their stories, and I want to particularly acknowledge the single mums, the people of colour, Māori and Pacific particularly in people with disabilities. These groups of people on the margins were often subject to the worst treatments. I also want to acknowledge the amazing work being done in this area. The page quite often gets asked for advice, and we were able to pass those people on to organisations like AAAP and CPAG, and the support that those two organisations in particular have given this project is absolutely massive and would have fallen over in a heartbeat without their incredible generosity and support of us. There's also some real life consequences of people sharing their stories, even if they're doing it with the hope to affect change. Materia lost her job, and she was the leader of a large political party and still didn't have enough systemic cushioning to keep her job going. The real life consequences for people who are already living in poverty, people who have been in abusive relationships, and people who are subject to multiple marginalisations could be huge. So it was important that people were able to be anonymous or semi-anonymous. Even the artists who were volunteering for us, a lot of them asked to be anonymous as well because they were experiencing pushback when they went into gigs. We also didn't approach people to ask them for stories or pressure anyone to share. We just had an open door policy about sharing if they wanted to. We would send them the art beforehand so that if they had changed their minds, it didn't have to go live, and they were able to edit or take down. We were able to edit and take down stories at any point in time if people did change their mind. We did this project voluntarily. Mostly it was people from within rainbow communities, mostly it was people who are beneficiaries. Thousands and thousands of hours of volunteer time has gone into this project. It's taken massive tolls on mental health, finances, and our lives. And we gifted this amazing and powerful report to Parliament, and it's been largely ignored, which is heartbreaking. And I think when I first started doing this project, I thought it would be a small way that me and friends could feel better, and then it exploded into something much, much bigger, and I began to hope, and that hope kind of filled me up and kept all of us going throughout the 3 or 4 months that it really kind of boomed. And over the last 3 years, thinking about the Labour government coming in and holding these stories and kind of saying, nah, not going to do anything, just feels really gutting and awful. But we still have these wonderful, beautiful pieces of art and stories that exist, and actually we got approached by the National Library to house some of these stories, which was really amazing. And they worked with us in our kind of pickiness around wanting to make sure to protect people's privacies and anonymity if they needed to, and they were really gracious and lovely and saw the value in beneficiaries in our stories, which is quite amazing. I hadn't had that experience from big institutions before, and it's really kind of changed my approach and my experience engaging with the archives and libraries and organisations. So, there's small wins as well. And I think for some short time we were able to feel like a community where our voices were heard, and there's some amazing things, and usually, under each of these stories there's 10 other people saying, yep, that happened to me too, or here's my different version of this. So whilst we've kind of collected, I think, about 400 stories now, there's thousands underneath. say.